So welcome to this webinar on the use of the wide range assessment of memory and learning 3rd edition, or the WRAML3, in educational assessments. I'm Dr. Jennifer Puig, and I'm a research director on the WRAML3 project. A quick disclaimer, the WRAML3 training materials are protected by federal and international copyright laws. The qualified WRAML3 user is granted permission to use the materials for training only. The materials are not to be shared with any non-authorized user and are not for any other distribution. All right, so the learning objectives that I have today for this webinar are to provide you with a basic history of the WRAML and describe changes from the WRAML3 to the 3rd edition of WRAML. Discuss the types of WRAML3 scores and how they contribute to crafting meaningful interventions using a case study. And finally, to discuss a bit of evidence of concurrent validity for the WRAML3 among measures commonly used in schools. I'll begin with a brief overview of the history of the WRAML and an introduction to the WRAML3 to provide a foundation for the presentation going forward. The original wide range assessment of memory and learning was developed by Drs. Wayne Adams and David Sheslow in 1990 and was the first psychometrically sound and standardized instrument assessing memory functioning in pediatric populations ages 5 to 17 years old. Since its initial publication, evaluating memory functioning across the lifespan has become more prominent due to the increased interest in the role of memory impairments among children with attention and learning problems, as well as the need to evaluate memory concerns related to increased risk of mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias in the growing population of older adults. Accordingly, the publication of the 2nd edition of the assessment in 2003 extended the battery's age range through adulthood. The WRAML2 also expanded the assessment of memory to include working memory, delayed recall, and recognition memory. The 3rd edition has strong psychometric support, broad applicability, and flexible administration options to address the varying needs for memory assessment across the lifespan. The WRAML3 reflects advancements in memory assessments while maintaining a good portion of the prior edition's overall structure. The WRAML3 is a level C instrument that can be administered to children as young as 5 years old and adults as old as 90 years old. Administration is paper and pencil only, with no digital administration options at the time of its initial publication. The WRAML3 was published in June 2021 with norms that were collected prior to March 2020. Although many of the subtests from the WRAML2 remain the same in terms of administration procedures, updates were made to the subtests to make them more developmentally appropriate across the age span and to make the content more contemporary. New delayed recall subtests allowed for the development of several new index scores, including the general delayed index and the visual and verbal delayed indexes. New process scores were developed for several subtests. In addition to the existing screener format from the WRAML2, a brief format for the WRAML3 was developed to allow examiners different options for memory assessments when time constraints are of concern. Finally, a performance validity indicator was developed for the standard format of the WRAML3 to provide examiners with a tool to help determine whether students put forth their best effort during testing. The standard format of the WRAML3 has 4 subtests that assess memory and learning over time. As a result, these 4 subtests have 3 conditions: an immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition condition. For the picture memory subtest, the student is shown a picture for a specified amount of time and then given a response booklet with a similar picture and asked to mark which elements of the picture were changed, added, or moved. Once the student has finished responding, they're shown the original picture again for a specified amount of time and asked to look for anything they may have missed the first time. For the story memory subtest, the student is read 2 short stories and asked to retell as much of each story as they can remember. For the design learning subtest, the student is shown a single design learning stimulus card across 4 trials. The card has 18 different geometric shapes distributed across 4 quadrants. It is exposed for a specified amount of time and then removed. After a brief time delay, the student is asked to recall and draw the shapes in the correct locations. This procedure is repeated 3 times for a total of 4 learning trials. The verbal learning subtest is a list learning task in which the student is read a list of words for each of 4 learning trials and asked to retell as many words as they can remember after each presentation of the list. The student's responses are recorded across all 4 learning trials. All delayed recall conditions of these 4 subtests ask the student to recall the information presented in the immediate recall condition after a 20 to 30-minute time delay. All recognition conditions for these 4 subtests consist of multiple choice format questions in which the student must correctly identify information that was presented in the immediate recall condition. All recognition subtests are administered immediately after their respective delayed recall subtests. The remaining subtests for the WRAML3 have only one condition and assess cognitive functions that support memory and learning. For the finger window subtest, the student is shown a card with 9 holes in it, referred to as windows. The examiner places a pencil through the windows in a specific order, and the student is asked to recall the order by pointing with their finger. The difficulty of the items gradually increases as longer sequences are included in later items. For the number letter subtest, the student is read a sequence of numbers and letters and asked to repeat the sequence verbatim. The difficulty of the items gradually increases as more numbers and letters are added. For the visual working memory subtest, there are 3 item sets which are administered based on age. For individuals ages 5 to 9, the initial visual working memory items tap into short-term memory and attention concentration. Later items require mental manipulation of information that is characteristic of working memory. For individuals ages 10 to 90, all items tap into working memory, and the items become increasingly complex as the subtest progresses. For each item set, the examiner points to a series of pictures on a transparent card and asks the student to respond by pointing to the same pictures, but in a different specified order. For the verbal working memory subtest, there are 3 item sets in which the student is read a list of words consisting of animals and non-animals and asked to repeat the list in a specified order. For individuals ages 5 to 9, the initial verbal working memory items tap into short-term memory and attention concentration. Later items require mental manipulation of information that is characteristic of working memory. For individuals ages 10 to 90, all items tap into working memory, and the items become increasingly complex as the list of words becomes longer and the response requirements become more complex. The sentence memory subtest requires the examinee to repeat a series of sentences dictated by the examiner. As the subtest progresses, sentence length becomes longer and semantically and syntactically more complex. I'm not going to discuss this slide in depth, but I wanted to include it to show you the overall subtest and index structure for the immediate recall subtest of the WRAML3. For those of you who are familiar with the WRAML2, the structure did not change from the previous version. This slide shows the subtest and index structure for the delayed recall, recognition, and working memory subtests of the WRAML3. Note that the sentence memory subtest does not contribute to any of the indexes. This subtest was maintained as it serves as one way to qualitatively assess the continuum of an individual's verbal immediate recall skills when compared to performance on the other verbal memory subtests. That is, story memory tells you how well the person can recall a narrative. Sentence memory tells you how well they can recall individual sentences. Verbal learning tells you how well they can recall individual words. And number letter tells you how well they can recall strings of individual numbers and letters. Now I'll talk a bit about the performance validity indicator. Performance validity refers to the extent to which results on standardized testing reflects the student's cognitive functioning based on factors specific to the student. So what do I mean by factors specific to the student? Things like motivation, effort, fatigue, or hunger are all factors that can influence test performance, but are specific to the student. Measures of performance validity have long been used in assessments for adults and are increasingly used in pediatric assessments. 2 embedded indicators are combined to provide an overall estimate of performance validity. The first indicator is the score on the attention concentration index. The second indicator is the sum of scores from the first 5 items of each of the recognition subtests. During test development, the items most frequently answered correctly were moved to the beginning of the recognition subtests for the development of the second indicator. These two indicators are combined to derive a continuous performance validity indicator with a score of 0 suggesting acceptable performance, a score of 1 suggesting indeterminate performance, and a score of 2 suggesting questionable performance. The sensitivity of the combined performance validity indicator, that is the ability to tell when a student is not putting forth their best effort, is 0.52. And the specificity of the combined performance validity indicator, that is the ability to tell when a student is putting forth their best effort, is 0.99. The WRAML3 has 3 different administration formats, and administration time varies by format. The standard format of the WRAML3 is 17 subtests and takes between 70 and 90 minutes to administer. The 2 subtest version of the brief format takes 12 to 15 minutes to administer, and the full 6 subtest version takes 25 to 30 minutes to administer. The administration time for the 6 subtest version reflects only the amount of time required for administering the subtests and does not include the required 20 to 30 minute elapsed time between the immediate and delayed recall conditions. The screener format consists of 4 subtests and has an administration time between 20 and 30 minutes. So when would you use a brief or screener format? The brief format is a standalone memory assessment and can be used in situations where the student exhibits limited stamina and cannot participate in a full battery, when time constraints prevent the examiner from administering a full memory assessment, and when a sample of memory functioning is sufficient for the referral concern. The brief format has its own record form and response booklet that are separate from the standard format. However, the same administration manual is used for all formats of the WRAML3. The core subtests for the brief format include story memory and design learning, from which the brief immediate memory index is derived. The full version of the brief format includes 6 subtests: the immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition conditions. Story memory delayed and design learning delayed are used to derive the brief delayed index, and story memory recognition and design learning recognition are used to derive the brief recognition index. In addition to index scores, process scores, and unique visual and verbal subtest discrepancy analyses are available for subtests on the brief format. The screener format of the WRAML2 can be used when the examiner is unsure if the student requires a full memory assessment. The subtests for the screener format include the first 4 subtests of the WRAML3 battery: picture memory, story memory, design learning, and verbal learning. And the examiner can proceed with administering the full WRAML3 if scores from the screener format indicate that further assessment is needed. There are 3 indexes that can be derived from the screener format subtests, including the screener memory, visual immediate memory, and verbal immediate memory indexes. So the WRAML3 has even more scores than the WRAML2, and I'm going to review the types of scores that are generated from a WRAML3 administration, how to interpret them, and how they can be used to craft recommendations and interventions. The WRAML3 provides subtest scaled scores, standard scores for indexes, process scores, and scores available from discrepancy analyses. Detailed information about how to calculate and interpret the scores can be found in the WRAML3 administration manual. Each of the 17 subtests produces a single subtest scaled score that describes the overall performance on that subtest. A scaled score has a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. All scaled scores used on the WRAML3 are age adjusted. Subtest scaled scores are derived from the total raw scores, which is obtained from the sum of the item or detail scores earned on a given subtest. Subtest scaled scores are added to form sums of scaled scores, which are then transformed to derive index scores. An index score has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Index scores are not age adjusted because the subtest scaled scores from which they are derived are age adjusted. Process scores quantify what otherwise would be qualitative observations of test performance. These scores are not standardized and are reported as means, medians, standard deviations, and base rates. The WRAML3 also provides data for index comparisons, subtest comparisons, and process score comparisons to aid examiners in determining if the difference between a student's scores have clinical significance. These scores are not standardized, but are derived from standardized scores and are reported as base rates. If you are using QGlobal for scoring and reporting, QGlobal will provide these scores as part of the report. So let's talk a little bit about discrepancy analyses and process scores. Discrepancy analyses provide information about the statistical and clinical significance between two scores. For example, if you want to know how well a student remembers a story after a time delay, you'd not be able to determine this with the story memory delayed scaled score alone. This is because this score compares the student's performance on the delayed recall subtest to their same age peers, not compared to how much they were able to remember in the first place. A comparison between the student's performance on story memory and story memory delayed would give you this information. These two types of scores combined, that is, the amount of information the student retains over time and the amount of information the student retains in comparison to their same age peers, provides a more holistic picture of their memory functioning. Subtest and index discrepancy analyses determine the significance of a difference score based on two criteria, a critical value and a base rate. The critical value is used to determine whether the difference between two scores is statistically significant. Prior to completing these analyses, you will determine if you would like to use a 0.10 or 0.05 level of significance. If the difference between two scores is greater than the critical value, then the difference is statistically significant. However, just because a score is statistically significant doesn't mean that it's clinically meaningful. The base rate of the difference will tell you if a score is rare among the student's same age peers and therefore potentially clinically meaningful. The WRAML3 also includes process scores, which provide quantitative information about the mechanisms through which a student's subtest and index scores were obtained. With the exception of the story memory process scores, these scores are not standardized and, as mentioned previously, are reported as means, medians, standard deviations, and base rates. Although determining the clinical significance of a discrepancy analysis or process score is ultimately up to the clinical judgment of the individual practitioner, the general guidelines in the WRAML3 manual indicate that base rates in the 15th percentile or lower or higher, depending on the score, should be flagged as notable. So let's talk a little bit more about base rates. Base rates tell you where a score lies in the distribution of scores created from the WRAML3 standardization data. For process scores, base rates are age band specific. In other words, if you have an 8-year-old student that you're testing, you will compare the student's score to the scores of the 8 to 9-year-olds who participated in the WRAML3 standardization data collection, not against the entire standardization sample. Because the distribution of scores has two tails, process scores can be present at either end of the distribution. For example, if you are comparing a score on a test where higher values indicate better performance, for example, the number of words recalled on trial 1 of verbal learning, base rates at the lower end of the distribution will be clinically significant. However, if you're looking at a score where higher values indicate worse performance, for example, if you're looking at the number of errors a student makes, the base rates at the higher end of the distribution will be clinically significant. It's important to keep in mind whether the base rates you're interpreting are at the upper or lower ends of the distribution. This is a list of all the process scores included in the WRAML3. As you can see, the majority of them pertain to immediate recall subtests. For picture memory, commission errors are the number of times that an examinee marks something that was not changed, added, or moved on the picture memory subtest. For story memory, scaled scores are provided for each of the 2 stories administered and to the student and for the verbatim and gist responses. Verbatim responses are those details that the student repeated exactly as it was presented in the story, and gist responses are those that capture the essence of the detail without necessarily repeating it exactly. There is a discrepancy analysis that compares the amount of information recalled in the first story to the amount of information recalled in the second story. Sorry, lost my spot. Here we go. Now I can talk a little bit about design learning. Performance across the 4 learning trials of the design learning subtest and the delayed recall condition are mapped out on a learning grid that also provides the average learning curve for the student's same age peers. The learning slope analysis provides a quick comparison of the student's performance on trial 4 as compared to their performance on trial 1. Similarly, the retention analysis provides a quick raw score comparison of the student's performance on trial 4 of the immediate recall condition and the delayed recall condition to examine information retention over time. The quadrant analysis provides information about how much the student remembered from the design learning stimulus card per quadrant across all 4 learning trials, and can provide information about visual search strategies. There are 2 main errors for the verbal learning subtest: intrusions and repetitions. Intrusions occur when the student responds with a word that was not on the original word list, and repetitions occur when the student repeats a word that was previously said within a trial. Primacy and recency are scores that capture the extent to which the student was able to recall words from the beginning of the list and words from the end of the list, respectively. Like design learning, performance across all 4 learning trials of the verbal learning subtest and the delayed recall condition are mapped out on a learning grid that also provides the average learning curve for the students' same age peers. The learning slope analysis provides a quick comparison of the student's performance on trial 4 as compared to their performance on trial 1. Similarly, the retention analysis provides a quick raw score comparison of the student's performance on trial 4 of the immediate recall condition and the delayed recall condition to examine information retention over time. The verbal learning recognition subtest was designed to capture 2 types of errors within items. Semantic errors occur when the student incorrectly responds with a word that's related to the correct answer, and phonological errors occur when the student incorrectly responds with a word that sounds similar to the correct answer. So let's see how these scores can help fine-tune recommendations and interventions with a case study. So a couple of disclaimers before I begin. The first one is all of the data for this case study, including the background information, are completely made up and not based on an actual person. The second is the WRAML3 is insufficient in and of itself for making any diagnoses, crafting recommendations, or interventions. A comprehensive assessment looking at several areas of cognitive functioning, record review, interview, and observation is ideal. But for the purposes of illustrating how the WRAML3 can be used, we're just going to focus on the WRAML3 data here. So this student is an 8-year, 5-month-old child who was referred for an educational evaluation due to concerns about attention and reading problems affecting their academic achievement. Their developmental history indicates that there were no pre or perinatal risk factors. Cognitive and motor milestones were met within normal limits, and the student's developmental history is notable for expressive and receptive language delays secondary to chronic ear infections. These were first identified at 18 months old. But at the time of the current evaluation, their vision and hearing were within normal limits. The student's educational history is significant for speech and language services provided by the school district's early childhood special education program. These services continued until the student was 3 years old, at which point they achieved scores in the average range on tests of expressive and receptive communication. And in terms of family history, more educational history. The student has reportedly had difficulties with attention and concentration consistently since kindergarten. Specifically, the student has difficulties paying attention to lessons and often cannot answer questions when called on in class. Although they complete their homework, they have difficulties remembering to turn it in on time. The student's desk and backpack are consistently messy, such that it's difficult to find materials needed for lessons. The student's family history is unremarkable. They live at home with both parents and 2 older siblings, and there is no reported family stress or trauma affecting the student's academic functioning. So now that we have the background, first things first, prior to interpreting any of the scores, it's important to consult the performance validity indicator for a quantitative assessment of the level of effort put forth by the student. I say quantitative because the interpretation of this indicator requires clinical judgment based on behavioral observations of the child as well. That is, a student's validity indicator may suggest that they did not put forth adequate effort during testing, but other factors may have influenced their performance. So for example, a student who has been diagnosed with ADHD may have an indeterminate performance validity indicator because they achieved a low score on the attention concentration index. But because their test performance is consistent with their diagnosis, you would attribute the low score to attention concentration problems and not low effort. This student's performance validity indicator is acceptable, suggesting good effort. However, even with an acceptable performance validity indicator, it's important to consider the child's behavior throughout testing when evaluating a student's effort. But for the sake of simplicity, This student's behavioral observations of sustained effort during testing were consistent with the performance validity indicator and were acceptable. So all of the process scores for the WRAML3 provide a deeper look into the mechanisms through which the subtest scaled scores were achieved. In other words, while subtest scaled scores tell you what the child's level of ability is, process scores provide you with some insight into how the student achieved that score. In order to identify robust patterns of behavior, it's important to integrate process score findings across subtests and across test batteries. The commission error score for the picture memory subtest is a particularly important score to consider, as the score calculation for picture memory does not control for the number of errors the student made. That is, by marking as many items on a page as possible, the student may inflate their score on the subtest by randomly marking a correct response. The commission error score for this subtest allows you to determine if the student made significantly more errors than other students in their same age group, and allow you to qualify your interpretation of the picture memory subtest score. In this example, the student achieved a score in the very high range on the picture memory subtest, but also made a significant number of commission errors. The average number of commission errors for the student's age group is 3.5, and this student made 9 errors, which is in the upper 5th percentile. In other words, it's likely that the student's picture memory score was inflated due to indiscriminate or impulsive marking of responses. At a behavioral level, this suggests that the student may have difficulties with impulse control, which should be corroborated with other findings throughout the test. Moving on to story memory. This student achieved a score in the low average range on the story memory subtest. However, the pattern of scores is not uniformly in the low average range. Specifically, the student achieved a score in the very low range on the first story and a score in the average range on the second story. This difference was statistically and clinically significant with a base rate less than or equal to the 10th percentile. Behavioral observations of the student combined with this pattern of results indicated that the student may have had difficulties attending to the first story, but once they understood the nature of the task, they were able to pay attention to and recall the second story within normal limits. This pattern of behavior may indicate attention difficulties if corroborated with other observations and scores. Although there is no comparison score for the verbatim and gist scores, it's noteworthy that the student scored in the extremely low range for the recall of verbatim details and in the average range for the recall of gist details. This pattern suggests that the student is able to recall the overarching themes of stories better than the specific details. Moving on to design learning. Design learning features a number of process scores that provide some insight into how the student learns. Data is provided in a table and in a graph. This student achieved a score in the high average range for the design learning subtest. However, their pattern of learning across trials 1 to 4 were unique. In the table below, you can see that this student achieved relatively low scores on trials 1 and 2 with a base rate below the lower 15th percentile, but the scores for trials 3 and 4 were within or above normal limits. For learning tasks with multiple trials, performance on trial 1 in particular, and sometimes trial 2, can be interpreted as measures of attention. This pattern of results indicates that the student may have difficulties initiating attention, but after a few trials is able to attend and respond within normal limits. This is consistent with what was observed on the story memory subtest, in which performance on story A was significantly lower than performance on story B. The design learning stimulus card is divided into 4 quadrants with an equal number of details in each quadrant. The quadrant analysis provides data about the amount of information the student recalled per quadrant across all 4 learning trials. This can provide some insight into visual search strategies. For example, this student recalled fewer details from the right side of the card than from the left side of the card, which may be indicative of ineffective visual search strategies, but this would need to be observed on other measures or in behavioral observations. This is the design learning grid, which maps out the student's performance on each of the immediate recall trials and the delayed recall trial. The line with the white dots represents the student's performance, and the line with the black squares represents the average performance of individuals in the student's age band in the standardization sample. The grid can quickly tell you any patterns of unusual results, and the table will tell you if the base rates for those results were noteworthy. As you can see here, the student's initial learning starts out low compared to the same age peers and then accelerates after trial 2 and remains high after a 20 to 30 minute delay. The student's retention score also shows that their performance on trial 4 was consistent with their performance on the delayed recall subtest. And I should also say I added the retention scores after I made the handouts, so you might not see those on your handouts, but I added them to the slides. All right, moving on to verbal learning. The verbal learning subtest has even more process scores than the design learning subtest. Like design learning, the verbal learning subtest features process scores for performance across each of the 4 learning trials. The student achieved an overall verbal learning score in the average range. However, as you can see in the table, this student demonstrated a similar learning pattern for verbal learning as design learning. That is, the student recalled relatively fewer words on trials 1 and 2, but their recall on trials 3 and 4 were within normal limits. This pattern of results further suggests that the student experiences some attention difficulties. The types of errors that the student made were also examined. Specifically, the student made 4 intrusion errors, which is above the upper 5th percentile for their age. High numbers of intrusion errors can be an indication of impulsivity, difficulty tracking responses, or perseverative responding. In this instance, behavioral observations indicated that all of the intrusion errors were made on trials 1 and 2, suggesting impulsive responding on the initial trials that were later absent when they were fully focused on the task. The student also made 3 repetition errors, which was above the upper 15th percentile. Again, these errors were mainly found on trials 1 and 2 and suggest the student experienced difficulties with tracking responses. Primacy and recency are 2 other process scores that are components of verbal learning. Memory research shows that when presented with a list, most people are more likely to remember the items at the beginning and the end of the list than in the middle. This is called the primacy and recency effect. Unusual patterns of responding in which only primacy or only recency or neither primacy nor recency are observed can be associated with ineffective memorization strategies. So for example, you have a student who repeats the first few words on the list and completely misses the last half of the list, and some neurological conditions. This student's recall of the words at the beginning and the end of the list were within normal limits. So here's the verbal learning grid, which maps out the student's performance across all 4 immediate recall trials and the delayed recall condition. As you can see, the student remembered fewer words on trials 1 and 2 than same age peers, but learning accelerated after trial 2. Unlike design learning, the student's recall of words after a 20 to 30 minute delay fell to levels below age expectations. The verbal learning retention score shows that the student's performance on the delayed recall condition was significantly lower than their performance on trial 4, with a difference in the 5th percentile. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the verbal learning recognition scores. And I added this slide this morning, so it isn't in your handout. The semantic and phonological errors results are a bit unique because they show an instance where a high base rate doesn't necessarily mean that a finding is clinically significant. So this is due to the skewed distribution of the scores in the standardization sample. And there's going to be skewed distributions of scores for most recognition subtests. Because recognition tasks are very easy, the vast majority of people in the normative sample do not make any errors. And this causes the score distribution to pile up at 0 and results in high base rates for clinically insignificant scores. So the graph is my mock-up of a positively skewed distribution where most of the scores pile up at 0. It's not the actual distribution of the scores, but it gives you an idea of what's happening. So although this student's base rates were in the 15th percentile, the raw scores were 0, indicating that no errors were made and that this finding is not clinically significant. So moving on to the discrepancy analyses. The index discrepancy analyses are provided for many, but not all combinations of index scores. These discrepancy analyses provide a high-level view of the student's strengths and weaknesses across the immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition memory tasks, as well as strengths and weaknesses across memory in visual and verbal sensory modalities. As previously stated, the statistical and clinical significance of the difference between scores is evaluated in determining the ultimate significance of a discrepancy. For the purposes of this case study, I chose the 0.05 significance level because I knew a high number of discrepancy analyses would be generated in this report, and I wanted to avoid interpreting spurious significant results. Examiners who are generating a report with fewer discrepancies or for assessments that aren't considered high stakes may wish to use the 0.10 significance level. These discrepancy analyses provide some insight into the process through which students forget information. In general, the discrepancy between immediate recall indexes and the general delayed index tells you how much information the student was able to retain after a 20 to 30-minute time delay in comparison to the immediate recall performance, which is one measure for getting over time. Comparisons between the general delayed and general recognition index are provided to examine the different mechanisms through which students can remember information. The delayed recall subtests are free recall tasks, which are generally more difficult as they require the student to organize information, retrieve it, and then respond. Recognition tasks tend to be easier as the items provide contextual cues that organize information for the student. Students who have difficulties with the delayed recall condition but do well on the recognition condition may experience difficulties with organizing and retrieving information in order to show what they know. The comparison between the attention concentration index and the working memory index provides information about whether a student experiences strengths or weaknesses with foundational cognitive skills or higher order executive functioning skills. Multiple discrepancy analyses are provided for visual and verbal sensory modalities. Examiners are encouraged to interpret the pattern of strengths and weaknesses across these index comparisons and not just one significant finding. Two of the index discrepancy analyses are italicized. That's because the data for these analyses were not included in the initial WRAML3 publication, but are provided in a tech report that's on the Pearson website. These scores are automatically generated when you use the Q Global Scoring Assistant. So this student had several significant index discrepancies. Their visual immediate memory index was significantly higher than their verbal immediate memory index, and their visual delayed index was significantly higher than their verbal delayed index. This suggests that the student experiences specific difficulties with free recall of verbal information. There is an additional significant discrepancy between the visual immediate memory and the attention concentration index. This interpretation needs to be qualified by the uneven performance that the student demonstrated on the two subtests that contribute to the attention concentration index. As you'll see in the coming slides, the student performs uniformly better on visual tasks than verbal tasks, which is likely driving this discrepancy. This highlights the importance of also examining the subtest discrepancies in order to generate hypotheses about factors that contribute to the index discrepancies. The student's general recognition index was significantly higher than their general delayed index. This suggests that they may experience some difficulties with mentally organizing and retrieving information, and that extra help from contextual cues helps them to remember even more information. Like the index discrepancy analyses, the subtest discrepancy analyses can be used to test hypotheses about the student's memory functioning and determine whether the index scores they contribute to are good overall estimates of the ability they measure. Data related to obtained differences between various subtests are provided as critical values at the 0.05 and 0.10 level and base rates. For the purposes of this case study, the 0.05 significance level was used. Subtest comparisons for the memory subtest provide insight into how well the student recalls contextual information presented once or twice versus relatively non-meaningful information presented across multiple trials. Subtest comparisons for the attention concentration and working memory subtest can provide additional evidence for strengths and weaknesses in different sensory modalities. This student subtest discrepancy analysis shows general consistency between subtests for the immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition conditions. Significant discrepancies are present for the subtests that comprise the attention concentration index and working memory index. For both, the student performed better on the visual subtests, that is finger windows and visual working memory, than the visual subtests, which are number letter and the verbal working memory subtest, which is consistent with the pattern of discrepancies among the index scores. As mentioned previously, the index discrepancy between the visual immediate memory index and the attention concentration index needed to be qualified due to the student's uneven performance on the underlying subtests. The WRAML3 manual recommends examining underlying indexes and subtests when a significant discrepancy between two scores exists. In this case, the student's low score on the number letter subtest has lowered the attention concentration index score and contributed to the significant discrepancy between the indexes. However, a closer look at the subtest indicates a pattern in which the student performs well on visual subtests, but experiences difficulties on verbal subtests, which is consistent with an overall pattern of stronger visual skills than verbal memory skills. But wait, there's more subtest discrepancies. In addition to examining subtest discrepancies within memory conditions and constructs, additional analyses are provided to allow examiners to interpret differences between immediate recall, delayed recall, and recognition subtests. Comparing the examinee's performance on the immediate and delayed recall conditions provides the examiner with information about how much content the student remembered. If the scaled score for the delayed recall condition is significantly lower than the scaled score for the immediate recall condition, then the student may experience difficulties with encoding, storage, or organizing information. If the reverse is true, the scaled score for the delayed recall condition is greater than the scaled score for the immediate recall condition, then the student likely benefited from additional storage and consolidation of information during the elapsed time between conditions. Comparing the student's performance on the delayed recall and recognition conditions provides information about their ability to organize and retrieve information. Specifically, significantly higher scores on the recognition condition than the delayed recall condition generally reflects difficulties with information retrieval as opposed to encoding and storage. That is, the information has been stored, but the individual needs additional supports in order to correctly retrieve it. Higher scores on the delayed recall condition than the recognition condition are less straightforward to interpret and might require consulting the performance validity indicator. For these subtest discrepancy analyses, the only significant finding was for the story memory delayed and story memory recognition comparison. Specifically, the student performed significantly better on the story memory recognition subtest, suggesting that they were able to encode and store information from the stories, but had difficulties organizing and retrieving this information for the immediate recall and delayed recall conditions. So taken together, the results from the student's WRAML3 score profile revealed three general patterns. So difficulties with attention and impulsivity, better performance at visual tasks than verbal tasks, and stronger recognition than free recall at a global level. Although the student's attention concentration index score was in the average range, they demonstrated notable patterns of attention difficulties with the process scores. So specifically, a lower score on story A and trials 1 and 2 of the learning subtests suggests that the student experiences difficulties transitioning and redirecting attention from one task to another. They'll likely need support with transitions in the classroom, such as visual reminders and advanced notifications of changes to the schedule. Difficulties with impulsivity were also noted with the high number of commission errors on the picture memory, the high number of errors on the picture memory and verbal learning subtests. And the student will likely benefit from additional support to check their work for errors. The pattern of index and subtest score comparisons indicated that the student demonstrates stronger visual memory skills than verbal memory skills. Given this child's history of language delays and hearing difficulties, it would be worthwhile to reevaluate speech and language skills to ensure that there are no difficulties in other areas of functioning in need of support. Assuming the student's speech and language do not require additional intervention, it might be helpful to recruit visual skills to support weaker verbal skills in the classroom. And finally, the student's stronger recognition than free recall skills suggest that they're unable to show what they know without additional supports. This is consistent with teacher reports that they're unable to answer questions when called on in class. So a behavior that may have initially been attributed solely to attention difficulties might also be exacerbated by difficulties with mental organization and retrieval. To the greatest extent possible, questions should be posed in a multiple choice format, particularly if the questions pertain to something that's said in a lesson or read. So those are some of the ways in which the process scores can help recommendations and interventions. I also realized that the prospect of administering 17 subtests to get all of this information about a student is quite impossible given the massive needs of students today and the time constraints that are placed on school psychologists. So that's one of the reasons why the WRAML3 brief format was developed. As mentioned previously, this format consists of the story, memory, and design learning subtests and their associated delayed recall and recognition conditions. All of the process scores and discrepancy analyses that were presented for these subtests are also included in the scoring for the brief format. The main difference in scores for the brief format are the index scores and the way that the verbal and visual patterns of strengths and weaknesses are identified. So instead of looking at indexes and subtest discrepancies, you just look at the discrepancy between story, memory, and design learning for all of the conditions to provide a snapshot of the student's visual versus verbal memory skills. So I reran this student's data for the brief format, and you can see that a similar picture emerges in which scores on design learning are significantly higher than scores on story memory for the immediate and delayed recall. For this slide, I only posted the scores that are different from the standard format. So moving on to more data. In the last part of the presentation, I just wanted to take a few minutes to review some of the validity data that was collected during the standardization phase for WRAML. I'm going to focus on studies in which the WRAML3 was administered with other measures that are commonly used in schools. So the first data comparing the WRAML3 to the WRAML2, and then data comparing WRAML3 to WISC-V and WIAT-4. So a WRAML3 and WRAML2 study was conducted to determine the relations between the previous edition of the WRAML and the current edition. These tables display the corrected correlation coefficients between the two tests, and the labels for the WRAML3 subtest and index scores are used because they changed slightly from WRAML2. The first 6 subtests of the WRAML2 and 3 battery are highlighted here. Despite changes to the content and administration procedures for the subtests, for some of the subtests, the correlations remain high. They are highest for verbal learning and number letter, as these subtests underwent the fewest changes. And although not shown on the slide, the recognition subtests had the lowest correlations in the study, and these results were attributed to the change to the response format. So WRAML3 has a multiple choice response format, whereas WRAML2 had a forced choice yes/no format. Correlations between index scores were generally high, and no correlation was provided for the general delayed index, as this index did not exist for WRAML2. So taken together, these results indicate that the WRAML3 measured similar constructs to those measured in WRAML2, despite the changes made to the content and administration procedures to the subtests. So moving on to the WISC-V, here are the correlations between the major WRAML3 indexes and the WISC-V full scale IQ, general ability, and cognitive proficiency indexes. All of the WRAML3 index scores are correlated highly with the WISC-V full scale IQ, but correlation patterns between the GAI and CPI tell an interesting story. So the general delayed index is more highly correlated with the CPI than the GAI, and this might be due to the role of executive functioning in organizing information such that it is easily retrieved for free recall. The general recognition index shows the opposite pattern, in which it's more highly correlated with the GAI than the CPI. Since the recognition tasks remove the executive function component for delayed recall, that is, the questions organize the information for the student, performance on this task depends on how much information was encoded and stored, which may be more highly associated with the cognitive skills associated with the GAI. A similar pattern of results was present for the brief delayed and brief recognition indexes. The attention and concentration and working memory indexes show an expected pattern in which they are more highly correlated with the CPI than the GAI, although this is more pronounced for the attention and concentration index. In general, patterns of WRAML3 and WISC-V correlations were consistent with that expected based on theory and based on previous patterns of research looking at WISC-3 and WRAML2. In general, indexes that assess the same constructs are more highly correlated than indexes that assess different constructs, and constructs that share similar response requirements or utilize similar sensory modalities are more highly correlated than those that do not share similar response requirements or utilize similar sensory modalities. This snapshot of results on the slide also shows how underlying constructs assessed by WRAML and WISC are interrelated. Finally, here are some selected correlations between the WRAML3 indexes and the WIAT-4 indexes. There are generally moderate correlations between the general immediate and general delayed indexes and the reading, writing, reading, written expression, mathematics, and total achievement indexes of the Y-4. There are lower correlations between the recognition indexes and the reading, written expression, mathematics, and total achievement indexes. This makes sense because the Y-4 academic skills require a substantial amount of mental manipulation of information in order to generate a correct response, whereas the recognition subtests only require the student to identify the correct response. This is also reflected in the generally high correlations between all of the Y-4 indexes on this slide and the working memory index of the WRAML3. It's also notable that all of the WRAML3 indexes are most highly correlated with the oral language index of the Y-4. This may be due to the strong oral language components to the WRAML3 verbal subtests in which the student must respond verbally, and may be also due to the ways in which most people encode and store visual information. That is, most people rely to some extent on their language skills to recall visual information. Taken together, these results reflect the importance of working memory and by extension executive functioning skills in academic achievement, as well as the strong relations between the cognitive functions assessed by the WRAML3 and oral language skills. So thank you for attending this presentation. Please feel free to reach out to your assessment consultant or representative for questions or more information. If you have a question that we were unable to respond to, please enter it in the survey at the end of the webinar. So now I'm going to try to navigate back to my camera to see if we have any questions.
Hi, Jen. This is Lisa Drozdick. We have had quite a few questions come in around the attention measures.
Sure.
Particularly, and also in their relation to the validity measures. So are scores on the attention measures enough to evaluate an attention difficulty? And also, are scores invalidated when they are so impacted by inattention or attention? So I know that was kind of a two-part question, so I'll let you, the basic gist is, how do we know if it was a memory or attention problem that has impacted the performance on the first subtests? So now I just added a third question, sorry.
So are the attention concentration subtests enough to determine if there are attention problems? Is that yes. The first part?
That was the first part.
I would say no. I would say that they are an important component of it, but as I presented in the process scores, there are many components to attention, and the process scores help to pick up on that, because the overarching subtests, well, they provide a good view of how the student performs overall on the subtest. The process scores tell you what's going on underneath. So while the student achieved an average score in design learning, they had lower scores on trials 1 and 2, which can be indicative of attention problems. So you have a lot of different ways to figure that out. And I wouldn't say that the attention concentration subtests in and of themselves are sufficient for that, but they do provide some good information about attention concentration. The second one is, how do you determine if it's attention and concentration or memory?
Well, the second was, given their role in the validity measures, what do you do if inattention is heavily impacting that value, and does inattention invalidate the WRAML scores?
I would say that you would have to incorporate them into your interpretations. So attention is really a foundational skill that affects multiple areas of memory, and that's why the attention concentration index is included in the WRAML. So if you have a performance validity indicator that is indeterminate because of low attention concentration scores, you would want to look for other signs of attention problems that could be affecting the test performance in other areas. If you had, variable attention can also affect the recognition subtest. So that's why there is that clinical judgment component that is really essential to interpreting the WRAML. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it invalidates the WRAML, but it tells you the ways in which this, because a student will genuinely have memory problems if they're not paying attention, because the information isn't getting in the first place. So the two, they're not exclusive. They're very linked in sometimes complicated ways. And that's an important thing to discuss in your interpretations.
All right, and that third one was how do you know when it's a memory or an attention difficulty that's impacting those first 4 subtests? That's
impacting the first, that would, I mean, behavioral observations and data from other tests. So that's a very difficult, you would have to, it's individual to each of the students that's in front of you. And that's why it's just so important to integrate all that information from questionnaires, from interviews, from observations of the child, and from other testing. Because again, the other thing about attention is it's variable day to day. And sometimes kiddos have really good days, and sometimes they come to you when they're hungry or tired or stressed out, and that affects attention as well. Sometimes like to think of inattention problems as the common cold of cognitive difficulties, and it could mean a lot of things, and it's a very fragile cognitive skill.
All right, thank you. I don't know, Ben, if you want to hop on and talk about the training pieces, but there were a lot of questions on further trainings, particularly ones that depicted the administration nuts and bolts.
Certainly, for anyone who has received the kit, there's a welcome letter in there that sends out a link to the BrainShark website that has a lot of modules and videos that kind of go through the separate subtests and how to administer them. I've put that in the chat a couple times. Based on a lot of feedback that we're getting, I will be planning to schedule another webinar upcoming shortly, where we'll kind of go in the depth of what the protocol is and how to administer it. Seems like we have a lot of questions about how to actually administer the webinar, or excuse me, administer the assessment during this webinar. So we'll be scheduling that one real soon. As well for the interpretive report, that is due to be released next month. And we are planning near the end of February to have the authors themselves come on and do a webinar describing in detail and going over some case studies of the interpretive report. So if you're interested in the interpretive report, keep an eye out on the webinar page, and we will start sending out emails for that soon when we get a date nailed down. We'll also be scheduling one soon for the actual administration. This is more of a higher level one that we did. This is similar to the other higher level one we had earlier. So in the future, we'll be getting more into the details that I know some people were looking for. So I appreciate you coming out, and Jen, obviously, for all the information you shared, and hopefully we can, throughout several of these, answer everyone's questions as they come up.
Well, I show top of the hour, so I'd like to thank you, Dr. Puig, for sharing your expertise with us. And, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thank you to our Q&A monitors for all of your help. Thank you for your participation, and please leave your browser open as an action item list will pop up for you. Look for your certificate in your email within 2 weeks. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and this does conclude our webinar. Thank you.